Well, in ministry, as you lead your church, there's going to be a lot of changes that come throughout the years. The question is, how can you communicate them? Well, today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 8 ways to communicate important changes to your church.
Well, hey, my name is Brian Brammer, and with me is Dylan Dotson, and today we are talking about 8 ways to communicate important changes at your church.
And this episode is brought to you by Mission Support. Mission Support knows you want to be effective in ministry, but like most pastors, you probably feel like you never have enough time, energy, or expertise to get everything done. And so Mission Support comes alongside pastors like you as a guide to provide expertise to do the things you don't know how to do and give you back the time you desperately need. So whether it's bookkeeping, SEO, websites, capital campaign, or any other services that they offer, you can talk to a guide today at missionsupport.com and go from feeling scattered to focus on your mission. It's possible to love being a pastor again. And as we always say, check out missionsupport.com and be sure to tell them you heard about them from Practical Church Planting, because if you do, you'll get 10% off any number of their services. So if you have an area you're stressed out, it's causing frustration, check them out. Missionsupport.com. There's a good chance they can help you with it, and let them know you heard about them from Practical Church Planting for 10% off. Now today, 8 ways to communicate important changes at your church. So, changes happen all the time. Some of them are bigger than smaller. These are ways, particularly for some of the bigger changes, we've talked about in various episodes, especially with social media, things you should and shouldn't do. But if you've got something big coming up, we just had something big coming up. We just went back to 2 services. As of this recording, it was yesterday.
Yep.
And so that's a pretty big change you want to communicate. So here are the different ways that we've done it, and just to encourage you, ways that you can let your other people know what's going on. Because here's what you know. You tell them a bunch of stuff, and people are like, no one ever told me. And to be fair, we all have a lot of stuff going on that we don't listen to, but I think sometimes we don't give them enough avenues to communicate it where it hasn't stuck yet. So here are some things you can do if you've got something important you want people to know. Number 1 is to share it from stage. Now you might be like, I know that. We're not just talking about church announcements, although those are helpful. This is also what you could do. You can preach the announcements. Now, I've shared in the past how we talk about sermons and preaching, how thanking everyone for being there and going over, starting your sermon with announcements. It's just a terrible idea. The only time you have 100% attention is in the first 2 minutes. So you got to start with something that people want to listen to. So typically some sort of story illustration to draw them in. One exception to that is if you have something you want to communicate, and sometimes people doing your announcements may not communicate them well, or, if you, like most churches, do the sermon later in the week and you want people to know what's going on. What I've started to do, because some guys I listen to that really like, I've noticed have done this. Well, they might say 1 or 2 things that they want to reiterate. They do it quickly because sometimes it doesn't work to preach it. So if, for example, I don't know, 2 services is a great example. There's not really a way to include that later on in the sermon. Although if you can, if you're doing trying to get more people in groups or serving, if there's ways to include it in the sermon, do it. If there's not ways to do it in the sermon, but you want it to be communicated well, then doing it at the beginning of your sermon can be helpful. My caveats are, you got to keep it to 30 seconds or less, and you got to have a lot of energy when you do it. Otherwise, people aren't going to listen. And so, again, one of the things for us, we're going to 2 services. Obviously, we mentioned it in the announcements. Mm-hmm. And then the last couple of weeks before we actually went to 2 services, at the beginning of the sermon, I also reemphasized that, hey, we're excited to do this. We're out of space. You guys are inviting your friends. It's awesome. You want to make it a big deal. And so sharing them from stage. Announcements, everybody gets that. Preaching them if you can, mm-hmm. And if they don't really fit into your sermon, saying them in the beginning, but you got to do it quick and you got to do it with a lot of energy. Otherwise, people will stop listening.
Yeah, the energy is the key word here because people are still shuffling in. Some might maybe 10 minutes into the service, and we're kind of we're about done that second song typically, and so playing the bumper video, and people are still shuffling around or they're getting their drink to get settled in. And so what you want there is if the energy is huge, then they're not going to ignore it. But you can't stay there too long because then it's now they're not even going to hear that first thing you have to say about the actual sermon.
Because that's part of it too. Some people don't hear it. Depending on where your announcement placement is, they might not hear it. Or as Brian said right before we started recording this, that he went to a previous church where he didn't like the worship music, and so the coffee would always run through him during the worship music, and he was back for the sermon.
Yeah.
So
I had to go.
Yeah. So that one might seem obvious, but you want to share it from stage. Given if you have someone do announcements who doesn't do a good job of them, you can do it, but you want to make sure there's some vision behind it. So don't be afraid to preach the sermon or to start your sermon with it, but it's got to be quick and it has to be a lot of energy, or else you will lose people. And so that one might be the most obvious, but there you go. Number 2 is your pre/post graphics. We call them whatever you want. Maybe it's something else.
Can you say it? Can you say
cannot.
it?
These are, the things that go on your screens before and after the service. You don't want to have a million of them because that's too many. I don't know. We normally have, don't know the right amount. We normally have like between 6 or 8 things that are important or things that are coming up. Not everybody sees them, but again, this is part of, or pays attention to them necessarily, but this is part of just trying to keep things in front of people, is to do pre-post graphics. Now, right before we started recording this, Brian mentioned we forgot one. So this is not the 9th one. This is 2A, 2B. Yes, in terms of graphics. We also, it's not really a graphic, but we call it this. We call it our bathroom graphic, where in all of the stalls and the urinals, we have a piece of paper, 8.5 by 11 with upcoming events. 3 at the most coming up within the month, or we might just do 2, depending on what it is. And it's just another way of it's just pretty much the date, time, and one, not even a sentence of what it is. And we put it in all the stalls and urinals. I also put a random fact on the bottom of them every week, because it's at least I don't really care about that, but I know every time I go to the bathroom, there's going to be an interesting fact, and I love interesting facts. And so graphics, that's the thing. You can put them on your, sliding them before and after service. And then we found in the bathrooms, to be most effective. I mean, again, if you're renting, some of this is different. You maybe can't put stuff against the wall. So even at the sink, you could do that. But we put those, what are those holders called?
I was going to mention, we put them in plastic things. I don't know what they're called, but so that you don't have
8.5 by 11. Yeah, we sticky, whatever the thing is called. Gosh.
Yeah, it's a Monday. It's just it usually is a Monday.
We stick them to the walls. We can change the papers out every week.
Yeah. You don't want just a piece of paper there, because it's going to get it's a bathroom. It's going to get wet and that kind of stuff. So I don't know. There are ones where you usually put a piece of plastic and it stands up, but these just smack on.
Everybody's listening to this is saying what it is, and we don't know what it's called.
Sorry we let you down.
But it's putting something in the bathroom, upcoming. Again, it can't be a lot, and you don't need to give them a lot of information. For us, it's just to let them know the time and the date if they're interested, and then the website or the URL link where they can sign up for it. So from your state, so these are not actually communicated, but obviously pre-post graphics and the bathroom graphic, as we call it, is another way that can be helpful. Number 3, small group leader guide. Now, I probably should have looked this up before the episode. I forgot. Somewhere within the last 3 or 4 months, we did an episode on how we create our group leader guides. We call them community groups, but whatever you want to call them. But part of what we do is we actually have 2 to 3 church announcements at the top of them. So our group, our how we do our groups is they're all sermon based, and so I'll write them every week that goes with the sermon. So they're really easy to facilitate. But the first thing they'll do when you actually get to the guide is there's 2 or 3 church announcements, and again, it's the announcement, time and date, and then 2 sentences at most. You can't, if you have 5 sentences for each one, people are going to read it. They're going to be not going to be listening. And so stuff that's coming up, and it's just another touch point. And so, if you have an event or going to services, or really it's just for your events, anything coming up, any changes that you want people to let people know of, including them in your small groups can be helpful, especially if how your church does it, whether they're sermon-based or whatever, if you're the one that creates the guide, to throw those in at the very beginning so that they're always said. And it's interesting to me, people just like to be in the know. So I've had people tell me hey, we're really glad you put church announcements or whatever in the group leader guide. And I'm like, has anyone ever said that they're glad to hear church announcements? But I've heard that from multiple people. It just helps people feel in the know. And the nice thing is too, it's people can talk about it with one another, or if they have questions, they can ask the leaders and the leaders can ask us, but including them in your small groups. Now, this is harder to do if how you have your group structured is everyone's figuring out their own thing. You can tell them, hey, try to remember this. But for us, it's really easy because they're literally, everyone's using the same guide and they're reading from it. And so, it's not like a separate email. It's the thing that they're using to lead the discussion. It tells them what to say right in front of them.
So I share my leader guide with the people actually in my community group, so they can kind of look at it ahead of time. Yep. So are the chances of them reading the announcements, it's probably smaller, but have you ever thought about, if you're at church, sometimes you can get distracted by things. So even if the pastor is mentioning it, or during next steps or announcements, they say what's coming up, people will still ignore that. So when you reiterate it in a smaller group where you probably have more people focused on you, that environment is just more inclusive to that. That's another way to get them okay, the leader's talking, I shouldn't be goofing around right now, or, whatever.
Going to the bathroom if your name's Brian.
That's right. If you do worship in a community group. But so it's just another touch point, but also that smaller, intimate atmosphere. I think people pay attention more.
Yep. And it allows them to talk, especially if it's more of a social event, like we've done trivia nights or whatever. It's they can, people might say, hey, I'm going to this or whatever. But putting them in your group leader guides, again, if you don't write a leader guide and people do their own thing, I would still say, hey, can you ask your group or mention this to your group? But if you provide a leader guide and you just put them on there, again, I just want to emphasize 2 to 3 at the most, and 2 to 3 sentences at most. Otherwise, people won't listen. And I would always recommend anything longer than a month out, like it's just not worth really sharing. Now, if it's big stuff, Christmas, Easter, it's like that's fine. But generally speaking, people don't need to know your next 6 months because they're not going to plan their lives around it anyway. So, personal opinion, do with it what you will. That's number 3. Number 4 is the church email newsletter. Now, I want to say these are like you should do all of these, not just like pick some of them. Our encouragement to you is like if you feel like people are often saying we didn't know. I wouldn't just get frustrated with people. I would say we're all normal. We're all the same. If you were not leading the church and you're hearing a lot of people say, people didn't tell me, you probably would say the same thing. If you had another job or you're not focused on this all the time. And so I just would encourage you not to get frustrated with your people and say, okay, why am I hearing this a lot? It's probably because you need to adjust something. So do all of these. Hopefully they'll help you. Number 4 is your church email newsletter. Now this one might be the most obvious. I don't claim to be the best at this. How ours is, we send one every week on the same day, which is a Thursday, just because it kind of reminds, even if it's not necessarily about Sunday, it's reminds them that church is coming up. I talk to church planners and here's my recommendation on it. Do whatever you want. You send one a week. If you send more than one, people aren't going to read it. That's just too much. You can do special things here and there, but that's fine. Ours is just a plain text email, so it doesn't have a bunch of graphics and all these sorts of things because people generally read emails that are just plain text to one another. And sometimes, email providers don't like all that fancy stuff and doesn't come out well. Ours is not great. Ours is literally, but it's just upcoming events. And then at the bottom, because we do, as you guys know, various videos. So typically our Bible in the Minute is part of it, and then random facts. It's not a random fact, but it's a Bible dad joke every week, and it is excellent. And so I've had people say, I just scroll to the bottom and read the dad joke. And I'm like, that's okay, because they're opening it,
yeah.
and they might read something. Yeah. That's literally why we do it. And you can, sometimes people ask me, hey, I heard you say this in the podcast. Can we do it? We don't know any of this. Do this. I literally Google Bible dad jokes, and at the bottom I do a PS, I don't know what else.
Dad joke. You should start putting them at the beginning, the middle, and the end. It might work.
Last week's was which Bible character had no parents, and it was Joshua, son of Nun. It's that's amazing. So anyway, just do something at the bottom so that people will do. I do the same thing with my personal weekly newsletter, The Best Minute. I do a Twitter thing that's really funny. Anyway, the church email newsletter. Again, I generally speaking wouldn't do anything more than a month. You can give a little bit more information, but it can't be more than a couple sentences. Otherwise, it's just long paragraph stuff, and then you can kind of link if there needs to be a sign up or something like that. But if your email is you got to scroll to get through everything, then it's too long. And so if you got a lot of stuff coming on, maybe it's only the next 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how big your church is and all that sort of thing. And so, church email newsletter, that one might sound obvious, but it's another touch point.
I'd say the only thing I add to that is with the 4 that we've already mentioned and the 4 we're getting ready to mention. The reason why you want to have as many avenues as possible is because people communicate differently. So as we talked about in previous episodes, I'm obsessed with my email, which is kind of a problem. So I'll read all my emails. I mean, not the ones that are obviously spam or whatever, but I'm going to find out. I think I find out more announcements through the newsletter, even though I'm on staff. That's where they resonate with me. Where with others, it's going to be the screens, it's going to be the funny joke. So we have all these not because we are wanting everybody to think, breathe all the announcements. They all have different ways that they digest stuff,
and different places go different. And you can announce things in different avenues. So your announcements from church. Again, we've got an episode somewhere on church announcements and what we'd recommend. I would recommend no more than 4 at the most. And for us, that includes our Connect card, which we mention every week. So we only got 3. Also, you really limit. You don't share everything. If it's not relevant to everybody, there's different rules on what you should share from stage, what you shouldn't. So we're more particular about what we share from stage. Some of these other ones you can share, like the newsletter. Again, part of this is church size and how big you are and how much you got going on. But we share most things in the newsletter. Or the bathroom graphics that we have, we'll share more things on the bathroom graphics than we necessarily will on church announcements because they're kind of more general. Or if you have things for just men and women, the bathroom graphics are also a great place because you're literally you can target that as well. And so some of these, you can share more things. The church email newsletter is a pretty generic thing. And so for us, given the size of our church, we share pretty much everything, even if it's gender specific or age specific, because we're at the size that we can. If you're a larger church, I don't really know how to do this, but you're probably not listening to this if you're a mega church. So, it's different as you get bigger. But for most of you that are planting, I would say this. If you're planting, I would still recommend sending out a newsletter every week, even if you're I don't know what to say. Give them some vision, something you're excited about, and one thing coming up. But it's just good for people to hear from you. So church email newsletter, is another way to communicate changes. Number 5 is an email from leadership. So this is different than the church newsletter. So when we went to 2 services, for example, I didn't email anybody, but Brian, who's over our hospitality, he emailed all his hospitality people. Emilia, who's over New City Kids, she emailed not just all the kids, not just the people who are serving, but also the parents who are being affected by the change. And then Kevin, our worship and production guy, he emailed all of his worship and production people. Now, part of this is like, we actually told, people like to be in the know before you make a big announcement. And so before we announced we were going to 2 services for sure, we were going to announce like on a Sunday because we wanted to make sure. With COVID, attendance is a lot more fluid than it was pre-COVID, and so we just wanted to make sure like we're kind of out of room. But we emailed all the serve team before and say, hey, in February, we're likely going to 2 services. Here's what it's going to look like. We made the announcement on Sunday, and then that week, everybody emailed not just the generic church email newsletter, but they emailed their teams, and they told them what it was going to look like. And so, again, personal emails too. Sometimes if you use MailChimp or whatever, newsletter platform, some of that goes to spam, or if you have Google, go to like the promotions folder so you don't always see it. You do see personal emails. And so, especially if it's a big church announcement, if you're lead pastor, you could send it out, or if you have teams that are leading specific areas and it's relevant to them. But sending out personal emails as well is really helpful.
And I've noticed that when you do send out personal emails, they will hit or miss if they respond, but if they see you in person, they'll say, hey, I got your email. Yeah. And so it's like, not I got a email, I got your email. So what I did is I sent out a lot more emails than maybe I should have, but because it's community groups and then
because over groups as well,
hospitality, stuff like that, and just the logistics, I sent out that one email saying, we're more likely going to go to 2 services in February. Then once we did, then I sent out a preliminary, this is what it's going to look like. And then I was like, I'm going to email each team separately, which was a lot of work, but I think this past Sunday went without a hiccup, other than the coffee taking forever to brew. That's a different story. But that was really helpful because it also shows them that I'm being intentional with every team, every group, and I'm not just sending out this email that the whole team wrote together.
Yeah.
And it being a smaller church, like, there's a lot of crossover, so they're going to know, who had a personal email and who didn't. So you want your staff all to be kind of pursuing that same type of personal touch.
And don't be afraid to let people know. Like for us, we didn't say for sure in the email because we were waiting until Sunday. Mm-hmm. But like if we were, I would have no problem telling the people who serve we're doing this before we make a big church announcement, because it makes them feel valued and in the know. And so if you have something coming up, again, there are times where you need to wait, obviously, to share everything at once. But if you know something's coming up, go ahead and I'll make sure I'm not taking up a future point. Go ahead and just start having conversations about it. I was saying we were going to go to 2 services this year anyway. In April, at our 6th year, I was like, we're doing it. So I started having conversations with people. Obviously, we just had to push it up because we were running out of space. But don't be afraid to like let people know what's happening before it's like a whole church announcement thing, because people feel valued that way as well, especially people that are it affects a lot or are making a big difference at your church. So not just a church email newsletter, but also personal emails from the leadership, depending on what's going on, can be helpful as well. Number 6 is texting. We call it the all church text. We used Text in Church in the past. Now currently we use Clearstream because we do some short code stuff that Text in Church no longer does. And then somebody posted in our Facebook group recently, they were also trying to sign up with Clearstream to do the short code thing, and I think that's even changing now. He's like, I couldn't do what you're doing because now it costs more money. So if I'm getting this correctly, we got in right before things went really expensive. Regardless, I'm going to recommend having some sort of provider where you can send mass text out to your church, because texts get like a 90-something% open rate. Now, the thing for this is I would not send a text every week. Like for us, it's like once or twice a month. Yeah. I mean, you could probably do more than that. I could be wrong. Maybe once a week would be fine. Anything more than that, you're probably going to start getting a lot of unsubscribes. And so we did, like, when it came to 2 services, the thing that's tricky too, like 2 services is tricky because you want people to know about it, but you don't want people to be confused if you haven't yet switched to 2 services.
Oh yeah.
So for us, we only gave a 2-week heads up just because like we didn't want to confuse people. And so the last week at 1 service, we sent an all church text saying, hey, don't forget, we're still at 1 service. And then the week leading up to the 2 services, we sent another church text saying 2 services or whatever. And so we sent a text every week for like 3 weeks in a row, which is pretty rare. But I could be wrong. Maybe once a week is fine. I wouldn't do more than that because then it becomes a thing of like, it just feels spammy. But we do we've got an event coming up, and it's relevant to the whole church. So again, if it's like just half your people or whatever, this would not be a good way to do it. Although you can certainly segment your church texting into groups, and so that would be fine as well. But doing an all church text, again, some of this stuff is going to cost money, like newsletter, these texting services. As we say often here at New City Church, or not City Church, sorry, Practical Church Planning. Our thing is like this stuff costs money. If you're in a spot where you're doing this by yourself and you're not with a network or denomination or an ascending church, you're probably not set up for success in the long haul. We're pro all church sizes, big, small, house church, all that stuff. Most people, especially listening to this, you're probably wanting or aspiring to lead something greater than a house church, which is fine. But if you don't have systems and structures and fundraising in place, you're going to have a hard time getting there. And so stuff like this church texting costs money. It's not terrible, but it's necessary, especially if things are changing and you want to keep people in the know. And so not everyone logs into the all church text. What we do to get phone numbers is any new person, we've got a follow-up process where they get a series of automated texts and emails over the course of 3 weeks. We also always put their phone number in the all church notifications, and they can opt out if they want to as well. But that's how we get all the new people in there as well, is we put them in both. They give you their contact information. They expect to hear from you. And so that's what we do. Also, as a side note for the email newsletter, obviously when somebody gives us their information, we put their email in the email follow-up. But we also put it in the email newsletter. What I started doing last year is helpful as well. Is I send an email anytime somebody gives for the first time. I've got this email that I sent them and say, hey, thanks for giving. Here's what you can expect from us. We send quarterly giving statements. If you have any questions, please let me know. But I also then take that email and put it in the newsletter. If they're giving financially, they probably want to know. Mm-hmm. And unless somebody signs up on a Connect card, like it's really hard to know. It's really hard to. You probably don't have everybody's email in their newsletter that you think you do. And so that's a proactive way that I do it, is that, every Tuesday I've got a reminder to see if we have any new givers from the last week. And if we do, I email them, and I also put their email in the church newsletter in case they haven't subscribed to it, so they also can be in the know as well. So that's just a way to get more people in there. But all that to say, an all church text, don't do too many of them, but that's a highly effective way. Number 7, social media. Now, if you listen to this podcast, your social media is not a billboard. And typically when you post church announcements, you get less engagement, which if you get less engagement, they're going to suppress your other stuff as well. Mm-hmm. So we very rarely post about church events on our social media. I mean, very rarely. We did 2 services was a different thing because people are excited about it. But when we do our community group pushes, we don't post about it. We do Discover Lunch, which is our kind of the beginning of our partnership process for people to learn more about New City. We don't post about it on social media, which might sound weird, but nobody engages with it and nobody cares, and then nobody sees it. And then so this you want to be careful of. If it's an important change, which is the title of this episode, although we're kind of talking about updates in general. If it's an important change, though, social media is warranted. You could do a graphic, you could do a video. The nice thing, if you do want to share announcements, which again, wouldn't recommend doing this very often on social media. Doing them in video format instead of a graphic is much better because people watch videos, and if they see a graphic of this upcoming thing, they don't really care. But anyway, if it's a big thing, you want to post it on social media. We talked about earlier, a couple episodes ago, how vertical video is really big. All the people, even Pinterest has vertical videos now, so that's something everybody's doing. So one of the things that we do to let people know what's coming up is every Friday, for now at least, we're posting here's what's coming up this weekend at New City. And so it's another way. It's not just about the event. It's about what we're preaching on, whatever. That's small things to do as well. But social media is an avenue. You just want to limit this to only really important changes, not every event your church does, because people won't engage with those posts, and then people will see even less of the stuff that matters.
Well, and then this Sunday video, it's a story, right?
Yeah, the Sunday video we do is 60 seconds, and it's not even just event. It's here's what we're preaching on. Here's an event that's relevant to this. It's not even future stuff. And so this one, but it's just another way to let people know what's happening. Yeah.
Well, and the reason why I asked that is because it shows for a certain amount of time, a day, and then it's
if it's a story on Instagram.
Yeah, so it's not a post that's gonna clog your social media Instagram, and because after that Sunday, it's irrelevant. Yeah, and so now no one's gonna engage with it. So I think that's something to consider. Is if it's something that people are gonna engage with, or maybe even some pictures, let me go back to that church because that was a really cool picture. That's always gonna have what do they call it, evergreen content. Yeah. But if it's stuff that's just one-time thing or really only pertinent to specific group of people in your church, it's wise not to collab.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So I'll mention this briefly. This might be helpful. So every Friday, we post a less than 60-second video like we just recorded. It was like this Sunday, hey, Genesis 3, talking about the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A lot of people can get kind of confused what's actually going on there. Don't forget, we're back at 2 services, and then we have our quarterly all-church Zoom meeting at Sunday at 5 o'clock. The nice thing about these videos is we just post them as stories and on Facebook, but we don't put them on YouTube. So like our Bible in a Minute that we do every week, obviously we want people to see that. People don't need to see what's coming up on Sunday on our YouTube channel because it's irrelevant in like 2 days. And a lot of I think we're almost about 800 subscribers now because of the stuff we've been doing. Like hardly any of those people are like coming to New City anyway. So it's not really relevant to them or to a lot of them. So anyway, social media is an avenue, but please keep it to only important things that people really need to know. If you're posting all of your events, like nobody cares. Now, if you want ideas on what to post, we've got some various social media options or episodes. Another real simple thing is if you go to practicalplanting.com and you can get our Church Planters Guide to Social Media, which is like we're giving you a template of what to post and how to be consistent with it. And it's like super, super practical, hence the name Practical Church Planting. So check that out at practicalplanting.com as well if you want to get a guide. It's totally free, and it can kind of walk you through what you could post, even if you feel like you don't have a lot of content right now of what you can do there. So social media. And then last but not least, number 8 is your personal social media. Now, your personal social media actually will always perform better than your church's because, especially like on Facebook, it's like a page, so it gets suppressed a lot. And people like to follow people more than they like to follow organizations, which is why sometimes I get annoyed because sometimes you'll hear people talking about like, when I search Bible studies on YouTube, I see a bunch of people. I don't see churches. Churches, this is an area where you need to like make more Bible studies. And we've actually done quite a few Bible studies over the last couple of years at New City Church, and they do fine. But it's like, we're a church. Like it is what it is. People are much more likely to follow a person than they are to follow a church. Now, I say that to say you should still make content. Like we've done Bible studies, we do the Bible in a Minute, all that sort of thing. I would not be surprised. Like we do it through New City, but it wouldn't be. I bet like if I had my own personal YouTube channel and I did Bibles in a Minute, they would perform better than New City's, even if I had less subscribers, just because I'm a person and I'm not an organization. So don't get too discouraged. If you're doing good content and it's not blowing up, some of that is just hard, and it is. You're not a person. Now, I'm not saying you should be a person. You can do whatever you want. But anyway, what I'm saying is your personal social media will perform better, especially because it's a person and you have more relationships. And so maybe you're not friends, let's say on Facebook or on Instagram with like everybody in your church. But if you say something or if you like reshare something from your church page, you might get some engagement. More people might see it. Now, I would caution, particularly on Facebook, resharing your church's page all the time. I'm friends with some pastors. Like, all they do on Facebook is like reshare their church's Facebook. I'm like, then you also become a billboard. So there can be times for that. I'm more talking about posting something on your own. So like if you're going to 2 services, your church might have some Insta stories and stuff, but like what I did the last 2 weeks was like, hey, this is what's happening, just so you know. And what was interesting is I had a couple people message me about it, like some friends and stuff that like who are pastors who like follow New City stuff, and like when they saw it on my personal one, they're like, "Oh, 2 services, that's awesome. We didn't know." It's like they see it, and so if there's something coming up, don't just like reshare what your church is doing, but say something about it yourself, and you'll hit some more people.
Yeah, don't assume that people are following these organizations more than are people. Like, I think that's a safe point to say. I don't know. Maybe, I guess I can say this. Like, also, don't go too hard on personal. I guess,
right.
Because, and not only just for the algorithm and stuff like that, but I've seen some pastors or even some lay leaders that are influential do it so much to where now people are attaching this body of believers to an individual. And then if something happens to that individual, they move away or, for whatever reason, then that really, your church kind of takes a hit. So I don't know. There's kind of like, that's just a personal experience that I've seen where it's, you want people to understand that you're a church because you love God and you love them and the community, not because it's just so-and-so attached to it. And, and sometimes you can't help that, because you could have very charismatic team, very charismatic, pastor. But I don't know, that should maybe something to keep in the back of your head, like just don't overdo it.
And I think too, with this personal social media stuff, it's helpful. Like some people post a lot, some people aren't on at all. Do whatever you want to do. I don't care. If you're someone who's on social media but doesn't hardly ever posts, but you only post about your church or repost your church, it becomes less helpful. So if you do want to like post stuff about your church, that's great, but also like post about what you're doing with your family or your life or some other interesting. Otherwise you also become like a billboard and people will tune you out. And I don't know if people are like, this. I unfollow, especially on Facebook. I actually don't mind Facebook because I unfollow everybody all the time. I mean, I'm just like unfollow. I just like, especially if I don't know you or we used to be friends, but like we've moved away. It's like, it's just not, I don't care. And I've actually found it more enjoyable. So I unfollow all the time. So anyway, yeah. So just, if you're going to post social media that can be helpful, just don't only post about your church if you are going to post about it, but that could be another way to reach more people. So, hey, those are 8 ways to communicate important changes at your church. My guess is you might be doing some of them, but all of these are really doable. And so I recommend doing all of that, particularly if you hear from time to time, people are like, I had no idea. I feel like for us, we don't get that very much. I feel like people, generally speaking, know what's going on. And so that's helpful. Again, some of the things we mentioned, missionsupport.com, check them out. practicalplanting.com. Also on Practical Planting, you'll find out more information about the Practical Church Academy, which is what I lead. It's more access to me, answer personal questions about your church. I do monthly trainings, and so check that out as well. And if you're on Facebook, Practical Church Planting Facebook group, make sure you join that. You can ask questions. It's a pretty engaged group. And that's all we got. We'll see you next week on Practical Church Planting.
See you.